Hi, my name is Khatija Shakir. I work on the humanities team at Kapow Primary. Welcome to Primary Focus, the podcast for Kapow Primary, where we get stuck into conversations that matter most in primary teaching. This week's episode is one that I truly feel does not get enough light in the primary education space, and I can't wait to get stuck into it. Our question today is, what does diversity, equity, and inclusion truly look like in a primary education setting? My guests are the wonderful Katie and Rosa. I'm going to leave it over to you guys to introduce yourself there.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Khatija, and thank you for having me. I'm Rosa Legino Bell, historian, educator, and founder of Diverse History UK.
It's lovely to be here with both of you and with Kapow. I'm Katie Holstock and I am a primary arts specialist. I'm a researcher and I am most recently an author. I'm very happy to be part of this conversation.
So, together, we're going to be exploring the barriers that teachers face, going beyond tokenistic approaches and looking at any kind of associated and related topics like decolonisation and anti racism, and offering our teachers and our listeners practical tools and tips to support them in embedding diversity, equity, and inclusion in their practice. Now, I feel that teachers are already doing really good conversations and practice around diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I do feel primary teachers, especially, might feel quite fearful and concerned about saying or doing the wrong thing in this area. So let's start with that fear. What do you think is the most concerning or teachers find most concerning in this area?
I think you're completely right, and I honestly believe that most teachers and most schools have really want to ensure that the education that their students are getting is representative, is inclusive, and really, tells the story of every one of their students and their communities. But I completely agree, there is definitely a fear surrounding it. Unfortunately, some of these topics are sensitive, are even in some cases still seen as controversial, although they shouldn't be. Um, and what I've noticed in my career as a teacher and through my work as an education consultant, that the fear seems to be the strongest around teaching about LGBTQ plus communities, because that seems to be where parents are pushing back the most. Um, so I guess what I want to say about that, and this is not just teaching about LGBTQ plus communities, but actually anybody who is, falls under a protected characteristic under the Equality Act.
Hmm.
Under the Equality Act of 2010, we all in schools have what's known as the public sector equality duty,
Mm.
which means that we're not only encouraged to teach about representative histories and marginalised histories, but actually it's our legal duty to do so.
Mm.
So if there is any pushback from the community or from parents, actually there is a very clear legal framework that you can use to justify your choices.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you've mentioned the parent pushback. But I thought it was very useful as well that you've mentioned some legal frameworks that teachers can use to kind of bring this conversation about. Do you think there's any other barriers, Katie, in terms of teachers kind of trying to embed a diverse and inclusive curricula?
I think the reality is that with primary school teachers, they're generalists, with the best will in the world. How could you ever be an expert in 12, 13 different subjects, as well as all the other roles that teachers have,
Mm.
social worker and carer and psychologist and,
Yeah.
as well as being an educationalist. And I think the reality is that actually, if you look at the demographic of teachers,
Mm.
majority of them in Britain are white, middle class women. And I think as a result, people just feel that they don't have the tools and the language often in order to be able to tackle these subjects. I don't think it's that teachers don't feel that they should. I
Mm.
think it's that it's this general fear of really of getting it wrong.
Yeah.
Also, as I know we talked about before, sometimes I think it's this cycle that we really struggle to break. I know that in my own education, I remember my primary education extremely fondly. I remember the historical figures that we studied and the artists that we used, and of course they're all white, dead generally men, and so as a result, I think because we want to bring our own passions to the classroom, we very often find ourselves regurgitating the things that we learnt ourselves.
Mm.
And it takes time and it takes resources and it takes effort in order to be able to kind of re-educate yourself of all the amazing people out there who have been left out of our national curriculum. And, I'm being realistic about, we know how time poor teachers are,
Mhm.
expecting people to go back through every single aspect of the curriculum and search for these hidden people whose histories have been erased.
Mm.
It feels too big a problem, I think, for some teachers to be able to kind of tackle without support or guidance, of which I just don't think there's enough.
Mm. Yeah, that's a really interesting point as well about teacher time
Yeah.
constraints.
Yeah.
I definitely resonate with that one. I wonder if maybe this might be a good place to kind of define those terms, diversity, equity, and inclusion. What do they actually mean, particularly for our teachers who are new to the space or teachers who have already kind of worked so hard on this and have to break this down further when they're bringing it to SLT, for instance?
For me, it's about celebration. I feel like it is about making sure that every single child in your class is is shown the reality of our beautiful, wonderful, multicultural world,
Right.
recognizing that there are so many people with so many different cultures and different communities,
Mm.
but actually there's far more that brings us together. There's far more that connects us and there is
Mhm.
sets us apart. And I think it is just about opening these doors and shining lights so that children really see that full diversity
Yeah.
of life, whether it be sexuality, whether it be race, whether it be culture,
Mm.
so that everybody feels included in our curriculum. Your children don't see these differences, and
Mm.
so our job is just to show them, the wealth that our world has, and make sure that that is ingrained within our curriculum, not as one-off little kind of token units of work added on as an extra, but as sort of embedded as a golden thread through everything we do.
Mm.
To create a society that is equitable,
Mm.
we need to look at who has been historically persecuted and left out of the conversations, and not just historically, but continually today as well. And we need to, in this sense, through education, we need to ensure that everybody is starting from the same place. And sometimes that might be giving some communities extra chances to ensure that they're starting from the same place as everybody. So it's about starting points and making sure that everybody has a fair
Mm.
place in the race,
Yeah.
regardless of what's happened
Mm.
historically.
And it's absolutely not about replacement.
Mm.
So it is not about, taking out, certainly in art, my subject, taking out the white dead artists, who had enormous impacts on the
Yeah.
way that art has evolved. We want children to learn about Van Gogh and Monet and Picasso because these are hugely impactful figures. But what we want to do is also show children that they were not the only artists working at that time. They were not the only people who made a contribution.
Mm.
So it's about inclusion and about looking for those gaps, those voices, a bit like Rosie said, that have been silenced, and showing a whole kind of spectrum
Yeah.
of the people who have shaped the way that our world is today.
Let's say you're an SLT or a teacher kind of who's starting to look at the curriculum a bit more critically, and you want to embed a bit more diversity and make it more equitable and inclusive. What then would be the kind of the best approach?
The work that I do with diverse history
Mm.
has focused a lot on helping primary schools to create truly representative curricula rather than just tokenistically. It is completely about representation and adding on. It's not about removing histories or artists in the case of art. So how I've done this from a kind of practical perspective is, if I take an example of a school that I worked in fairly recently in Nottinghamshire,
Mm.
they were in a society that was, historically was very much working class. They had a lot of there was a lot of miners and kind of mining that happened up until, the 80s. And so they presented me their curriculum and they wanted to look at a local history. And so we talked about the idea of bringing in mining history and using that as a lens through which to look at the white working class miners. But we then discussed how we could use this
Mm.
as a way to look at other cultures as well. So I suggested bringing in the kind of stories and experiences of the Caribbean miners who'd come over post-war,
Mhm.
who were asked to come over by the British government in the post-war years. And a lot of them had become miners. And with the history of Nottinghamshire, the narrative is it's a society and it was an area where there was huge racial tensions, and of course that is one part of the story,
Mhm.
but actually we can look at the histories of the Caribbean miners and the white working class miners as a way to look at the friendships and the kind of the similarities between these communities and the relationships they had. And actually, there was a huge amount of positive history between the white working classes and the Caribbean miners, and that's often overlooked. So it's not about completely rebuilding curricula from scratch at all. It's about finding places, and it's what you were saying about the golden thread. It's about finding places to weave in a wide range of experiences.
Yeah.
So, for example, if you have a unit looking at the Tudors, why not use the research of Dr. Miranda Kaufman and bring in the Black Tudors, who, were there long before colonialism. They started, in fact, Africans have had a presence in Britain for from the Roman times and probably even before that. So there's opportunities in everything that we're already teaching to bring in a wide range of voices.
Yeah.
So it's not about rebuilding, it's about adding in.
Yeah. I think many teachers listening in would be very reassured. And sometimes it is taking the small steps to make the biggest impacts, isn't it? When I was working in a school, I remember our subject leaders would audit their curriculum as well. So just having a look at what voices are kind of missing. Like you mentioned with the migration, and I fully believe that British history cannot be separated from world history.
Absolutely.
We have a migration kind of theme. And going back to the school that I was talking about, they essentially asked kind of questions about what kind of voices are missing, in terms of do we have voices that represent people from disability communities? Have we looked at people from all kinds of disadvantaged backgrounds, but also advantaged backgrounds, because it is, like you said, a story of humanity. And if we can find places beyond history, beyond PSHE, beyond that, that'd be fantastic. It does take some digging around. So I know that you've mentioned looking and kind of you've got a school that came to you to kind of help with that kind of approach. But how about moving beyond that kind of surface level representation? How is that impactful for the children in terms of building their self-identity through the school career?
I mean, this is where I was going to go with it, actually. So
Brilliant.
I know that the representation part is hugely important, but I do worry that then we create a situation where people just look at their curriculums and we end up with almost we need to make sure we've got one of them and one of them. And, and I don't know whether that's almost a little bit taking it to, I don't know, almost like the positive discrimination level, which I think is not what we're looking for. We're looking for something that's really genuine and tangible. So for me, it's about putting children at the centre of what you do. So again, for art, instead of prescribing artists for children to study, maybe thinking about things that we all have in common. So for example, a unit on celebration. What does celebration mean to you in your home, in your community? And almost getting children to bring the art and the patterns and the colours that exist within their own communities to the artwork. So, all of best practice research into art talks about how important it is for us to give children really open-ended starting points where we don't, as a teacher, prescribe where the children will end with their artwork, but we start at the beginning and we kind of lay this foundation so that children can use their own experiences to create something that's authentic. So actually, something like how we celebrate, or what does home mean to me, or what is my favorite food, or, just getting children to really reflect on their own lives and seeing, the historical figures or the artists or the musicians that form part of their own identities. And then you as a teacher, the children are bringing this wealth of knowledge to you. It's not for you to have to go and do all the research and have all the answers. And I hope that sounds to some extent a little bit more reassuring for teachers.
Absolutely.
That, we're not expecting people to have the answers, but actually your children are a wealth of knowledge and experience that will be able to share things with you that you've never come across. Again, as a white woman myself, I recognise that I'm talking about diversity and, whether there's a little bit of a slight iffiness to that, because obviously my cultural experiences are extremely limited. But, what I did love about being a teacher and as a higher educator now is drawing on those amazing experiences and learning, and not expecting to be the person who is, like we know in teaching now, it's not about us just filling children's heads with knowledge. It's about us being part of that learning process. And I think that's the biggest opportunity that we have with diversity, is to just see yourself as a learner and not teacher.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And I think many teachers could relate to that very well.
Absolutely, that's such a lovely way to go, and to for it to be very student-centred and very student-led. The only kind of issue I see with that is is if, for example, I taught in rural Norfolk when I was still a teacher, and a lot of those students were from, similar backgrounds in terms of a lot of them were white, a lot of them came from working class or middle class backgrounds. And they absolutely needed to see themselves represented in the curriculum. Um, but it was also so important for them to see others represented in the curriculum, equally important. They need to be represented, but they also needed to learn about cultures and backgrounds that they might not necessarily see where they were growing up. So I guess that's where it becomes a bit more complex, because in terms of looking at their experiences, they're a fabulous source, as their families are as well. But again, speaking from, the perspective of a white woman, it was my responsibility as a teacher and the school's responsibility to kind of try our best to make sure that we were representing communities that were underrepresented there.
Absolutely.
And I suppose, and I think it's equally important for students to be represented, but also to learn about backgrounds and peoples that they might miss out on otherwise. But you're completely right. It is a bit of a minefield. And, we've got this, we've all got, or I like to think that we've all got the best intentions at heart, and we don't want it to be tokenistic, but we do only know our own experiences, So I guess bringing in people that can meet them where they are and help broaden their understanding of different backgrounds and cultures.
I think there's an interesting point there about cultural capital as well.
Yeah.
And the fact that, we talk about cultural capital, but, whose cultural capital are we assigning value to here?
Yeah.
And actually, if we just continue to tell children that, classical music is the highest form of music, and that, traditional art, Renaissance art is the highest form of art form, all we're doing actually, although we are increasing children's cultural capital by taking them to the National Gallery or maybe taking them to the ballet or all these wonderful things, are we potentially just reinforcing that kind of white middle class culture is the most valuable culture available? And actually, exactly what you're describing there, Rosa, is perfect.
Yeah.
We need to make sure that children recognise that the cultures that they are familiar with have value too. And so actually that giving children that ability to share and to celebrate and to enjoy. And you're right, in a community where it's mainly white children attending a school, we've got to make those efforts to bring people so that we are, bringing in authentic voices that are able to talk of their own experiences, rather than, again, as we've described, I'm a white middle class woman, I am talking about Black oppression, which is something that I really don't have any kind of authority to talk about. But actually, we can bring in, other voices and all sorts of amazing. There are so many people who are coming and do workshops and talks and really engaging, wonderful things. Take children on trips, take them out of their, out of their comfort zone, so children get to see this amazing wide world that we have. And like you say, how important it is to be able to see yourself represented so naturally and so authentically in the curriculum.
Yeah, I think that's all really fantastic, and I'm really excited. I'm getting very excited. And I think for a teacher, when they're in the classroom and they have done a lot of work around, let's say, DEI, what other things could they do to take it further? And I mentioned anti-racism a bit earlier, and I think it has a place in diversity, equity, and inclusion, particularly the equity part, when we're trying to create a more fair and connected world for our children. And whilst we live in a very multicultural society, we don't live in a very anti-racist society. And it's particularly now where we're quite divided in our country, unfortunately. How can teachers bring about these conversations safely and equipped with good knowledge? Where can they look for these kind of spaces?
Again, I think it's about having honest conversations. I don't think that any of us can walk into a classroom and be the provider of the correct answers.
Yeah.
But what we can do is point things out to children and have these really important discussions. Socially active practice in schools it's never been more important than it is now, where we say to children, okay, so in the past, maybe we have only learnt about white dead male artists. Why might that be? Who might that benefit? Who wants us to think this way? And what can we do about it? And actually, certainly in my subject of art, it's the perfect vehicle for children to really be able to explore kind of, okay, so who else was out there? Who else was doing things? And how could we use art to tell the world about how we feel now? Are there any injustices that we can see?
Mm,
And as we've talked about, very sadly at the moment, the world is becoming increasingly divided.
mm,
And actually, I think shining a light and showing children this and getting them to really understand and share. And yeah, there's going to be uncomfortable conversations, and
yeah.
children are very likely to bring opinions that might be quite divisive, because we are aware, aren't we, that, at the moment in our communities, there are a lot of very different opinions that are flying around. But actually, bringing those conversations to the forefront, I think, is surely the absolute right thing for us to be able to
Mm.
do.
Yeah.
So we can see, so children don't grow up in a silo thinking that there is only one way of thinking about things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I completely agree, Katie, with what you're saying. And to build on it, I think this is in line with what you asked right at the beginning around fears.
Mm.
As teachers, we are going to encounter um, problematic comments,
Mhm.
potentially racist, potentially homophobic, sexist. There's a lot of these views that are currently very much at the fore, shall we say. And I think that what's really important to note is in that moment as a teacher, when you hear something that you're shocked by, when you hear something that, you're surprised that a student has said, actually, it's really, really important to stop and to acknowledge it
Mm,
because silence isn't neutral and silence might be taken, even if this is not the case at all, silence could be taken by the students as agreement.
mm,
And although it's scary, it's important to stop and to talk about, link back to the values of the school and to the community and to, gently and calmly challenge it and say this, and actually even in an evidence-based way, calmly break down why there are other viewpoints to that
mm,
as well. And then, of course, importantly, that needs to go through your school safeguarding procedures and be reported to
mm,
SLT. But I would say it's really important to, not kind of become angry or to put that student down in front of the class, but actually instead to acknowledge it and to
yeah.
argue against it in a factual and evidence-based way, and then obviously follow the protocols afterwards. But there has to be discussion because otherwise that student's going to leave thinking, oh well, I was just shouted down and I still don't know why what I said is wrong
Mm,
or what the history of that is. And you mentioned at the beginning about primary school teachers being generalists, and I think that can be a barrier because maybe they might not always feel like they've got the sort of academic backing
mm,
to respond to it. So I would say, before you go into a session where you think that there may potentially be some prejudicial views, try to kind of project what they may be and come up with some responses beforehand so you feel equipped and you feel armed. We can't prepare for everything,
mm,
but it might just give you that extra confidence to break down these views if they do come up and to know exactly what you're going to do before they arise, and hopefully they won't, but just to be prepared in case.
Anti-racism is never going to be comfortable
Mm.
to talk
absolutely.
about. It
Yeah.
doesn't mean we shouldn't. It's so important, and actually, you it isn't about creating a battleground in your classroom where
Mm,
you aggressively take issues head on. But you've got to remember that children are young
mm,
and they have been impressionable, and they are likely to pick up opinions and things.
mhm,
Look at the amount of social media that children absorb now and how
yeah.
little that we see on social media is actually that we can guarantee is true or factual. So giving children the tools, I think, to be able to interrogate their own beliefs, I
Mm,
think is really, really important. Well, how do you know that that's true? You
yeah.
you don't have to be the teacher saying you are wrong, this is the wrong answer. But I think just with those very delicate kind of empathetic kind of feelings about how
Yeah.
do you think that must make people feel, or how do you know that that's right, or where have you got
Mm,
that information from, and can you think of anybody else who might have a different viewpoint? Your
mm,
job is the facilitator, and I think you shouldn't feel like that you are going into kind of referee between
yeah.
two sides of a very, very difficult issue. But your
Mm,
job is to ask questions and to listen and to
mm.
encourage people to listen to each other.
It can be daunting to go into a classroom. You've just come back from the weekend. You don't know what children have absorbed or kind of what they've listened to or what they've been doing. And you suddenly are thrown into this conversation. And sometimes you do have to think on your feet. And like you said before, it's coming from that empathetic kind of sense, isn't it? We want our children to be empathetic, but also to be critical thinkers, and whatever comes before them, to ask questions about it. And it's okay to ask questions. It's okay to. I remember when I was covering for an early years class, I had one child ask me, "Oh, miss, you got brown skin color." And I thought that was beautiful, because I was like, "Yes, can you find anybody else who has brown skin color? What color skin do you have?" And I think it's not shying away from those
Mm.
kind of differences, celebrating them.
Yeah.
That yes, we are all have different skin colors, and that's what makes us unique.
Yeah.
And it's encouraging that kind of build up of that conversation. So by the time they do leave year six, children can look back quite fondly and think, actually, I feel quite prepared for secondary school. And even if I see somebody who looks completely different from me, who has a different family structure, it won't throw me. I'm quite encouraged to ask questions.
And I think people like it
Yeah,
when you ask questions. That I
absolutely.
think it's really, really important that we feel comfortable in
Mm,
our own identities and in the ability to learn about other people's identities.
mm,
And I think the worst thing that you could do is pretend that we're all the same and that we should, there are lots of situations I'm sure with in cultural experiences where I wouldn't know what the
mm,
right thing to do was. And I would obviously be desperate not to cause offence.
yeah.
But I do feel from everything I've learned from this, and the more I work with children and the more I work with my adult learners at university, the
Mhm,
more I realise that the very best thing you can do if you feel uncomfortable is just to
yeah.
ask.
Mm.
And people would much prefer that than you clumsily kind of
Assume.
wobble about making assumptions. You're absolutely right, making
Yeah.
assumptions or say the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And generally people are extremely understanding if you do get it wrong. But I
Mm,
think people would just prefer you just to ask. And I think with the children in your classes as a primary teacher or with the families,
mm,
if there's anything that you are unsure about or you don't know how to handle sensitively, then just ask the question. I think people are always more than happy to share and feel
yeah.
seen.
But if we were going to give maybe 3 top tips for a primary school teacher who is listening to this, or a senior leader member who's thinking about this, or even somebody who's been thrown into this as a brand new teacher who's kind of not quite sure but really passionate about this topic, what could they take away? What could they really go away and do right now? Let's say in tomorrow's classroom.
So I would say, and I'm sorry, school leaders, to say this, but I would say, as a classroom teacher,
Mm,
um, you really do need the backing and the support of your SLT, because it will take time and it will take money. And I know money's something that we're, in schools that we're all short of at the moment, but it does take money and resources and time. And for individual teachers to be able to do the best they can to make the best diverse and representative and inclusive curriculum that will speak to the students,
mm,
it really needs the support, the continuing support of senior leadership. So I really, that's my plea to senior leaders around the country is, please do support your teachers. Ask them what they need.
mm,
Look at your students. Look at who you're representing, what type of backgrounds you're representing, and think about how you can make sure those voices are coming across.
The very fact that teachers are watching this podcast means that you recognize that something needs to change. And so be the change, but be it gradually and be kind to yourself. You're not
mm,
going to be able to overhaul your curriculum
Mm.
overnight and make the change you need. So be a learner, listen to podcasts. There are some amazing Instagram accounts, where you can find out about amazing artists and
mm,
historians, be a learner and go and gradually kind of increase your knowledge. Most importantly, talk to your communities, talk to your children. If you feel that your school is really a long way away from the way you would like it to
mm,
be, set up a task force, involve parents, bring in members of the community who you think can help you. You're not alone.
Yeah, and I would also say that, kind of from experience of working with schools, Um, a really good starting point is to do some CPD with all of your staff,
mm,
not just the teachers, but everyone that works at the school, and help them to understand why it's so important, why this is a mission that every member of the community should be behind. For
mm,
me, as a historian, that was always looking at society today through the lens of colonialism
mm,
and looking at how far or how much, to what extent colonialism has impacted the way society is set up institutionally and a lot of the prejudices that we still have today.
mm.
There are, in my opinion, direct links to kind of the foundations of empire and colonialism.
I think it's really insightful that you've mentioned the impact of colonialism. And I wonder if there's space in this conversation with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and embedding that within our curriculum on conversations around decolonizing the curriculum. What do you think of those?
I think it's really important. I
Mm,
think as Rose has been saying, it isn't just about let's make sure that we are representing, but
mm,
we really need to interrogate the decisions that have been made, the research that we cite, the evidence that we're using, and seeing about how these prejudices have
mm,
impacted even the very thought process, the very fibres of our education system today. And although, I think that's a big question for individual primary school teachers,
mhm,
I do think it is worth being aware of where the knowledge that we have all absorbed from our own educations has been sourced from, and where the kind of prejudices lie within it.
mm.
Mm.
And potentially why it's been erased. I
Mm,
think particularly in upper key stage 2, you can bring that in.
yeah, absolutely.
And that would be actively
Mm,
anti-racist because you're addressing that there has been a deliberate attempt to erase some
yeah,
voices.
Mm.
absolutely.
And I did find after doing CPD sessions, there were people that have said to me, I had no idea about this. Adults, I had no idea about this. It's given me a completely new understanding
Mm.
of the world and why this work is important.
Yeah. Thank you so much, both of you. As a teacher and educator myself, I have found this conversation really inspiring and really impactful, particularly how we can kind of support our teachers to curiously and comfortably embed diversity, equity, and inclusion into their practice. Before we wrap up, I'm going to put you on the spot one more time. And I want to ask you, what do you think is key to making sure every child gets the best possible start? I'll go with you first, Katie, and I'll come to you, Rosa.
It's it's culture and community in your school. It's about you putting yourself in the center and listening and learning from those people around you.
Mm,
The voices are there. They're little people sat on the carpet in front of you. Their voices need to be heard. And I think it's start there. That's the absolute top tip that I would give. Start there with the children and their families.
brilliant.
For me, this is a bit of a personal question because I'm a gay woman. I'm married with a lovely daughter, and I grew up and I was at school under Section 28. So I can say firsthand the experience of being under an education system where my very identity and existence was erased. It was not discussed.
Mm,
Relationships and genders that that were non-heterosexual were banned
mm,
actually by the government, by Thatcher's government.
mm,
And I didn't come out until I was 25 because I just felt that by being who I was, by openly being gay, it went against everything that I'd been taught was normal and was acceptable.
mm,
And so, let's look at our young people now. There's a huge variety in there. And we need to make sure that they don't feel silenced, they don't feel erased, and they don't feel that who they are is weird and abnormal,
mm.
because I know what that feels like, and I honestly think it had a negative impact on my mental health growing up, and I really, I don't want that for the next generation. So let's let's try and make sure that doesn't happen.
And over to you, listeners. If you're a teacher or a senior member or anybody in the educator space, because I think this can be relevant to even beyond primary education, what good practice have you seen around diversity, equity, and inclusion? Do share. We would love to hear from you on the comments below or at Kapow Primary on our socials. Thank you to our guests and thank you to you for tuning in. My hope is that our conversation contributes to a more equal and connected world. See you next time on Primary Focus.